At 11:37 a.m. on June 19, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Jake the Wrench Harrison wrestled his crippled Grumman F-6F Hellcat at 18,000 feet over the Philippine Sea. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning oil and expended ammunition, a grim perfume for what would soon be christened the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Harrison was not thinking about the 400 Japanese aircraft that were about to be erased from the sky. He was thinking about a single piece of aluminum rod the size of a man's forearm, which had just been vaporized. A split second earlier, a passing A6M0, exploding in a final act of spite, had sent a jagged piece of shrapnel straight through the control surface of Harrison's starboard horizontal stabilizer. It wasn't the kind of hit that brought a plane down instantly. It was the kind of hit that guaranteed a slow, terrifying descent into rotational instability, followed by a high-velocity impact with the ocean. The crucial elevator control linkage, the mechanism connecting his stick to the movable flap that controls pitch, was severed. Harrison's Hellcat immediately pitched down violently, the 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney engine screaming in protest as the nose dropped 15 degrees. He hauled back on the stick with both hands, his body straining against the 5 Gs of negative lift, but the stick felt soft, disconnected. The plane was flying, but Harrison was no longer piloting it. He was merely a passenger in a 2-ton metal projectile that was now intent on digging a hole in the deep blue Pacific. The standard procedure was immediate egress. At 18,000 feet, Harrison had plenty of time to parachute. His squadron mates, led by Lieutenant Commander David Finch, were already peeling away, shouting frantic warnings over the radio. "Wrench, you gotta punch out. She's tearing herself apart." Finch's voice crackled through the damaged communications set. "Negative, Skull One," Harrison replied, his voice calm, almost detached, despite the sweat pouring down his face, blurring the instruments. I think I can jury-rig the input." Finch swore violently. He knew Harrison's reputation. Jake Harrison was 27 years old, too old by naval aviation standards to still be a lieutenant commander flying fighters. But his progression had been stalled by a career defined by 2 things: an undeniable, lethal talent for dogfighting and an absolute contempt for the maintenance manual. He was the product of a small farming community in Oklahoma, where if a tractor broke down 7 miles from the nearest town, you fixed it with a shovel handle and baler twine. Harrison brought that farmyard engineering philosophy directly into the sophisticated complexity of naval aviation. He was the founding spirit of the famed VF-83 Skullbusters, an unofficial designation for the squadron, not because of their kill count, but because they were notorious for breaking regulations and getting away with it. The Navy's standard protocol required a 3-man team and 48 hours to replace a complex oil pressure regulator. Harrison once replaced one on the ground in 30 minutes, using a stolen engine gasket, a wrench borrowed from an Army mechanic, and a piece of wire coat hanger, earning him his infamous moniker. The senior brass hated him. The enlisted mechanics adored him. He was the poster child for World War II survival engineering. The core philosophy of the Skullbusters, drilled into them not by official directives, but by Harrison's constant insistence, was simple. The life support of the aircraft and the pilot is non-negotiable, and if the official procedures fail, the solution lies in improvisation and immediate action. They carried customized, lightweight repair kits, small bundles of specialized steel wire, extra rivets, and even high-strength adhesive tape, all strictly unauthorized. They learned to identify damage by sound and vibration alone, and they learned to fix things under duress. But fixing a severed elevator linkage, the primary control for longitudinal stability at 18,000 feet, while actively trying to keep the plane from tearing itself apart, was beyond even the Skullbusters training. Harrison checked his altimeter. 15,500 feet and dropping fast. The nose was still heavy, dipping constantly, forcing him to keep the power pegged and rely solely on the ailerons for minor stability adjustments, a futile effort. He could feel the tremendous strain on the wings. If he tried to make a hard turn, the asymmetrical airframe stress would likely peel the wing right off. He had minutes, perhaps less than 5, before the altitude and airspeed combination made recovery impossible. He took a deep breath, securing the stick between his knees to maintain the slightest semblance of forward flight path. The noise of the roaring engine and the shriek of the wind rushing past the bullet-holed canopy was deafening. "Skull One, I'm slowing down. Maintain defensive perimeter," Harrison ordered, his voice tight. "I'm going into the belly. Stand by for a wild ride." Finch watched in horror as Harrison's Hellcat, a smudge of dark blue against the enormous sky, dropped its landing gear. Not to land, but to use the drag created by the deployed gear to slow the aircraft down to a near-stall speed, an absurd, suicidal maneuver necessary for the task ahead. If the plane stalled now, Harrison would never recover. Harrison reached down, grabbing the emergency crank handle for the inspection hatch located directly behind his seat. That hatch was meant for pre-flight inspections, not in-flight structural surgery. He had to gain access to the control cables running back to the tail section. He had to stick his hand, literally, inside the machine while it flew. The moment Lieutenant Commander Harrison cranked open the heavy inspection hatch, the cockpit was overwhelmed by a violent, frozen blast of 150-knot air, dragging loose papers and dust directly into his face. The noise was no longer just the engine drone. It was a hungry, open roar. He was now operating in a pressurized cabin, while exposing himself to the extreme dynamics of 14,500 feet. Harrison secured the stick tightly between his thighs, maintaining just enough nose-up trim to keep the shuddering Hellcat from entering an uncontrollable spin. He flipped open the lid of his custom-made heavily padded canvas satchel, the one the naval inspectors tried 3 times to confiscate, and pulled out 2 essential items: a spool of high-tensile copper steel security wire and a 12-inch, heavy-duty adjustable spanner, a massive tool nicknamed the Breaker that weighed nearly 3 pounds. He reached blindly into the narrow access cavity, his heavy gloves immediately snagging on jagged metal. The airframe was screaming around him, the vibration so intense it made his teeth ache. He had maybe 2 minutes before the cumulative strain on his arms and back became too much, or before the plane, slowed to 160 knots, simply surrendered to gravity. His fingers found the damage at 14,200 feet. The severed control rod, a thin, light alloy tube responsible for pushing and pulling the elevator surface, was separated by about 3 inches. One end was pinned against a hydraulic line. The other was flexing dangerously near a fuel vent line. The danger wasn't just the inability to control the plane's pitch, but the possibility of the flailing rod and sawing through something vital. The rod needed a splinter-rigid bridge capable of transferring the substantial force required to move the elevator against the wind. Standard field repair would involve replacing the entire section on the ground. Harrison had to invent a solution using the geometry of desperation. His spanner, the Breaker, was the only item rigid enough. The move was simple in concept, but terrifyingly difficult in execution. He had to use the handle of the wrench to bridge the gap between the 2 severed rod ends and bind them together as one unit. With his left hand clamped onto an internal rib for leverage, and his body twisted impossibly against the seat harness, he positioned the heavy wrench handle parallel to the rod. The plane suddenly hit a pocket of turbulence, dropping 100 feet and slamming Harrison's helmet against the canopy frame. The stick slipped slightly, and the nose dipped, the altimeter spinning down past 14,000 feet. "Wrench, what's your status?" "We've got bogies closing from the east. You need to go," Finch yelled. "Hold position, Skull One." Harrison grunted, ignoring the warning. He was focused entirely on the metallic slickness of the wrench handle. He quickly bound the wrench to the forward section of the severed rod using the heavy steel wire, twisting the loops with the needle-nose pliers he kept tucked into his flight suit. The binding had to be excruciatingly tight to prevent slippage. The process took 45 agonizing seconds, the wind tearing at his exposed arm and the cold air numbing his fingers. Now came the critical connection, linking the wrench handle to the rear section of the control rod, which led directly to the elevator. If he made this connection too long, the elevator would be permanently up, nose down. Too short, and the elevator would be locked down, nose up. The fix needed to maintain the rod's original static length within half an inch. He held the wrench handle steady, sighting the connection points in the dim light of the fuselage, trying to mentally calculate the correct neutral trim position. This wasn't guesswork. It was a profound understanding of the Hellcat's operational physics, born from thousands of hours in the cockpit and hundreds of unauthorized repair sessions. At 13,300 feet, he started binding the rear connection. As he worked the wire, applying maximum tension, he could feel a faint, grinding vibration, indicating the Japanese attackers Finch had warned about were nearing. Finally, the splint was secured. The wrench handle was now a fixed, temporary part of the F-6F's flight control system. The whole apparatus was rough, asymmetrical, and entirely dependent on the tensile strength of 3 feet of steel wire. Harrison pulled his arm out, slamming the inspection hatch shut. He fought the latch, sealing the cockpit again, regaining the relative silence of the engine roar. He checked the stick. It was stiff, resistant, and heavy. The wrench had added significant inertia to the controls, but when he pushed forward, he felt the resistance of the elevator moving. When he pulled back, the resistance increased. The connection held. He kicked up the landing gear, and the Hellcat immediately accelerated, the air rushing past the wings with renewed speed. He applied gentle back pressure. The nose lifted, not violently, but obediently. Skull 1, the surgery is complete, Harrison reported. The patient is stabilized. Set for attack pattern. He looked out the canopy. The altitude stabilized at 13,500 feet. The battle was no longer distant. Directly ahead, 4 of 6 M0s were engaged with 2 of his wingmen, and they were approaching his position rapidly, having assumed the crippled Hellcat was dead in the water. 1-0, flown by a pilot who had survived the first massive wave of American fighters, broke away from the skirmish, banking hard and diving toward the slower target. This Zero was fast, aggressive, and entirely focused on finishing the vulnerable fighter. Harrison gripped the stick, feeling the unfamiliar, clunky resistance of the wrench below. He had fixed the plane enough to survive. Now he had to see if it could still fight. At 11:45 a.m., 8 minutes after the shrapnel strike, Lieutenant Commander Harrison found himself in a terrifying dogfight with a plane that felt alien in his hands. The Japanese Zero pilot, likely citing the deployment of the landing gear just moments before, was confident, pressing his advantage with a speed and aggression common among the veteran flyers, who had somehow survived the opening onslaught of the Turkey Shoot. The Zero was closing from Harrison's 2 o'clock high, using its superior climbing rate to gain energy before committing to the dive. Harrison pushed the F-6F to its maximum speed of 370 knots. The heavy resistance of the wrench splint meant that minute adjustments were impossible. Every movement of the stick required a massive, deliberate effort. Fine-tuning the pitch, the difference between a grazing shot and a kill shot, was a ghost of its former self. "He's on you, wrench. Brake right. Brake right." Finch screamed over the radio. Harrison didn't brake right. A hard lateral maneuver might shear the control wire he had just installed. He had to fight smart, relying on the Hellcat's armor and raw speed, and force the Zero into a low-speed, high-G maneuver, where the heavier Hellcat was more stable. The Zero opened fire at 600 yards. The tracers, a thin, luminous braid of destruction, streamed past Harrison's cockpit, singing off the armor plating behind his seat. He could smell the ozone and the faint metallic scent of the cannon shells passing close. Harrison executed a shallow, controlled dive, using the speed to open the gap slightly. He pulled back on the stick. The effort was immense. The control felt less like a sophisticated hydraulic system and more like pulling a heavy rope. The plane hesitated, then the nose finally lifted, achieving a shallow 30-degree climb. The Zero, expecting the easy target to continue running straight, was momentarily caught off guard. It overshot the dive, forced to pull up hard to re-engage. This was Harrison's chance. He executed a high yo-yo, a classic dogfight maneuver where the attacker uses a high-speed climb to turn and drop back onto the enemy S-tail. Harrison, however, used a bastardized, broken version of the move. He didn't climb. He maintained altitude, focusing solely on the Zero's turning radius. The Zero's greatest strength was its turn rate. Its weakness was its vulnerability to heavy machine gun fire. Harrison needed the Zero to turn in front of him into the line of his 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns. At 11:47 a.m., the Zero, now below and slightly ahead, began a tight, corkscrewing turn, trying to get onto Harrison's 6 o'clock. Harrison followed, keeping the turn radius wide to avoid stressing the temporary elevator repair. He dropped his left wing and stomped the rudder, forcing the Hellcat to slide sideways in the air, correcting his aim not with elevator input, but with raw lateral force. This unconventional, messy technique gave him a brief 2-second firing solution. The Zero filled his gunsight reticule. Harrison squeezed the trigger. The 6 Brownings roared, spitting out 75 rounds per second of depleted uranium core ammunition. The sound inside the cockpit was a satisfying metallic thunder that temporarily overpowered the wind noise. The stream of fire hammered the Zero directly across its thin fuselage and into the engine cowl. Smoke immediately bloomed from the Japanese plane, followed by a bright, blossoming flash of fire. The Zero pitched forward, completely out of control, trailing a thick plume of black smoke mixed with orange flame, plummeting toward the ocean surface 13,000 feet below. "Splash one, Wrench! You crazy son of a bitch! You shot him down with a broken tail!" Finch shouted, disbelief thick in his voice. Harrison did not reply immediately. He was breathing heavily, his forearms aching from the physical exertion of moving the heavily weighted controls. He checked his control surfaces. The stick was still responding, the wrench holding fast. The immediate crisis was averted, and the Zero was eliminated. But Harrison was now isolated. He was in a damaged plane, operating on pure adrenaline and improvisational engineering, and the sky was still full of targets. He was also far from his carrier, the USS Lexington, and he had burned significant fuel during his low-speed repair sequence. He looked at the instruments. Fuel gauge was dipping below the standard mission reserve. He had enough range for maybe 45 minutes of aggressive flight. More critically, the effort required to make even minor pitch adjustments was draining his strength rapidly. If he encountered another close-quarters engagement, he wouldn't last long. The dilemma was immediate: disengage and attempt the long, painful flight back to the carrier deck, risking the repair failing mid-flight, or remain on station, knowing the air was still infested with targets that had to be dealt with, and risk running dry far from safety. Harrison made his decision at 11:49 a.m. His squadron, the Skullbusters, was low on fuel too, and the Japanese retaliatory attack was still building. If he left now, the protection for his wingman would be compromised. The wrench held, and he had proven the plane could still kill. "Skull One, report to me," Harrison commanded, bringing the Hellcat back up to 15,000 feet. "We have 3 more bogies inbound from the west. Let's make sure none of them make it past the picket line." The engagement shifted from a singular duel to a brutal, grinding wave defense. The Japanese had sent everything they had into the June 19th attack, desperately trying to breach the American carrier defenses. For Jake Harrison, the repaired Hellcat became a blunt instrument of war, powerful and fast, but incapable of the delicate precision required for sustained maneuvering. At 11:55 a.m., three Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, heavy with torpedoes and escorted by three Zeros, appeared on the western horizon, cruising at 12,000 feet. Their target was obvious: the American fleet arrayed 150 miles to the east. The Skullbusters, now reduced to 4 operational planes, including Harrison's patched-up fighter, were positioned directly in their path. Harrison, leading the formation, understood the tactical geometry. Betty bombers were armored cows, but they carried lethal payloads. The Zeros needed to be stripped away first. Skull 2, Finch, take the high cover. Skull 3 and 4, stick close and hit their engines. Maintain 14,000 feet, Harrison ordered. I'm going low. The Hellcat's controls, heavy as they were, performed better in straight-line acceleration and shallow dives. Harrison pushed the nose down, leveraging the 2,000 feet of altitude advantage and plunging into a shallow, high-speed attack run. The first Zero escort, spotting the aggressive move, peeled off to meet the head-on threat. This was the moment of maximum risk. The Zero was lightly armed, but highly maneuverable. Harrison could only rely on his momentum and the superior frontal armor of the Hellcat. As the distance closed, Harrison noted the Zero pilot was banking slightly, preparing a deflecting shot. Harrison did not adjust his pitch. He committed entirely to the collision course. He locked the stick in a neutral position, refusing to risk any sudden movement that could shatter the wrench-based repair. He was flying a missile straight at the enemy. At 400 yards, the Zero opened fire. The heavy machine gun rounds glanced harmlessly off the Hellcat's thick windshield and engine cowling. Harrison held the trigger down for a burst of 4 seconds. The tracers, now perfectly aligned due to the lack of pitch adjustment, tracked across the Zero's canopy and fuselage. The Zero pilot didn't stand a chance. The plane instantly disintegrated into a massive fireball. Harrison flew straight through the debris field, the heavy Hellcat barely jostled by the explosion. He immediately leveled out at 11,500 feet, his eyes stinging from the effort of maintaining focus. He was now beneath the remaining bombers, a perfect position for a coordinated attack. But the physical cost was mounting. The effort of pulling the stick back to stabilize the dive had been enormous. His shoulder joints were beginning to ache, and the fatigue in his forearms was profound. He knew he couldn't maintain this level of physical exertion for long. "Target the lead Betty," Harrison commanded. 2-shot pass only, then get out of range. Don't waste fuel. He climbed rapidly underneath the lead bomber, his superior speed allowing him to ignore the gunner in the bomber's ventral position. He pulled up hard, the wrench protesting with a terrible grinding thunk, and unleashed a volley of fire into the bomber's unprotected belly. The Betty instantly vented fuel and began to smoke heavily. The critical phase was the disengagement. To avoid the bomber's defensive fire and the remaining Zero escorts, Harrison needed to push the nose down and dive to gain speed. He pushed the stick forward. The action was met with agonizing resistance from the patched elevator linkage. He had to use his entire body weight, leaning forward, fighting the mechanism. The plane responded sluggishly, but it responded. As he plunged downward, he glanced at his left wingman, Skull 3. The pilot, Ensign Miller, was struggling with a Zero that had attached itself to his 6 o'clock. Miller was twisting, turning, desperately trying to shake the attacker. The maneuver required aggressive pitch and yaw controls, precisely the thing Harrison aircraft could no longer safely execute. Harrison was 800 yards away and diving away. He faced a fresh dilemma, a brutal choice informed by the cost of his earlier repair. 1. Continue the escape, conserve his remaining strength and fuel, and leave Miller to survive the dogfight alone. High probability of Miller being shot down. 2. Reverse course. Re-engage the Zero and risk the patched elevator failing completely under the sudden stress of another turn or pull-up. High probability of saving Miller, but ending Harrison's mission and perhaps his life. At 11:59 a.m., Harrison tightened his harness, the decision already made. The pain in his arms was irrelevant. He had kept his plane flying to fight. Skull 3, brake low and hard right. I'm coming in hot. He pulled the heavy stick back, praying the steel wire would hold. The Hellcat resisted, groaning, but began its turn back toward the skirmish. Ensign Miller, focused entirely on the Zero glued to his tail, barely registered the radio command. The Zero pilot was experienced, using the lightweight fighter's maneuverability to stay precisely in Miller's blind spot, chipping away with short bursts of 20 mm cannon fire. Miller's port wing was already peppered with holes. Harrison's decision to return put him on a high-speed intercept course. His Hellcat, carrying immense momentum from the earlier dive, tore across the sky. He had to slow down rapidly without excessive G-forces that would endanger the elevator fix. At 12:01 p.m., Harrison pushed the control stick slightly forward, applying pressure to ease the Hellcat into a controlled skid, using the rudder to scrub off airspeed while maintaining a clear line of sight. The Zero chasing Miller was a mere speck, but Harrison knew exactly where he needed to be. Miller, following the emergency procedure for a hard brake, finally wrenched his plane into a vertical turn. This sudden change in direction momentarily exposed the Zero to Harrison's line of fire. Harrison squeezed the trigger. His stream of .50 caliber rounds, aimed with instinctual precision, cut across the Zero's path. The Japanese pilot, forced to choose between pursuing the turning Miller or evading the heavy fire from the approaching Hellcat, hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. The fire stream caught the Zero's engine cowling. The plane erupted in a small, localized puff of black smoke and spun out of the fight, spiraling down slowly. "Thank you, Wrench. You saved my ass," Miller shouted, relief flooding his voice. "Watch your six, Miller, and get back to the formation." Harrison snapped back. He did not have the luxury of basking in the victory. The physical exertion had left him momentarily dizzy. He needed to check the repair. He gingerly pushed the stick forward, then pulled back. The heavy resistance was still there, but now a new, unsettling sensation emerged. A faint metallic grating deep within the fuselage. The steel wire splint, holding the wrench to the control rods, was chafing against the airframe ribs under the sustained, heavy loading. The fix was weakening. The air battle was entering its most crucial phase. Finch and the remaining Skullbusters had accounted for the two other Zeros, and were now focusing on the 3 Betty bombers, which were still lumbering towards the fleet, 2 of them heavily damaged, but still flying. Harrison looked at his clock. 12:05 p.m. He was dangerously low on fuel, and the structural integrity of his plane was compromised. Every minute spent fighting was a mile added to his swim home. The American fleet had begun launching its second wave of interceptors, but they would take several minutes to reach this range. Harrison's 4 planes were the thin barrier between the damaged but determined bombers and the carriers. He rejoined Finch's formation. "Skull 1, what's the status of the Bettys?" "2 smoking, 1 still clean, Wrench. They're pressing hard." "Looks like they're going to make a run for it," Finch replied. "We take down the clean one first." "We cannot let 3 get through," Harrison decided. The final clean Betty bomber was flying slightly lower, hugging the waves, attempting to use the sea spray for cover. This presented a tactical nightmare. To attack, Harrison had to execute a steep, high-G dive followed by a sudden pull-up, a maneuver that could easily rip the wrench from its bindings. This was the final decision point. Survival versus mission completion. If the elevator failed now, there would be no time for another fix, no altitude to deploy a parachute. Harrison knew the physics. The Hellcat could handle the G-forces, but his improvised repair could not handle the leveraging forces. He had to hit the bomber, but he had to hit it on a path that demanded minimal stick movement. He chose the head-on approach again, the path of maximum courage and minimum pitch input. He plunged the Hellcat down at 12:07 p.m., the plane screaming past 400 knots, accelerating towards the surface of the Philippine Sea. The bomber's forward gunner opened fire, but the speed of the Hellcat made it an impossible target. Harrison's hands were slick inside his gloves. He felt the grinding again, louder this time. He was gambling his life on the elasticity of steel wire and the tension in an industrial wrench. He centered the crosshairs on the Betty's cockpit. The fuselage grew massive in his sight. He fired a devastating burst, ripping the cockpit apart and igniting the fuel tanks stored in the wing roots. The explosion was immediate and spectacular, enveloping the bomber in a massive oil-black fireball. Harrison flew straight through the center of the blast. The shockwave hit the Hellcat like a physical blow, rattling the airframe violently. For a terrifying half-second, the stick went completely slack. The wrench fix had finally slipped. The nose dipped precariously. Harrison, using the last of his adrenaline, wrenched the stick back into the side, fighting the stall, forcing the Hellcat to yaw, and momentarily compensating for the lost pitch control. He was flying purely on rudder and prayer. The plane was dying. He had accomplished the objective. The bombers were eliminated, the fleet was safe, and the first wave of incoming American reinforcements was finally visible on the distant horizon. Now, the mission was reduced to one final, brutal act, bringing himself and the crippled Hellcat home. If you think what Jake Harrison is doing here is insane, hit like. It has a tiny way to honor what they went through and help this story reach more people. Subscribe for more untold history from the front lines. Now, back to the wrench's flight for survival. At 12:10 p.m., the adrenaline began to drain, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion and a terrifying awareness of the aircraft's instability. Harrison had successfully defended the fleet and shot down 2 Japanese aircraft, but his machine was now little more than a controlled wreck held together by faith and a mechanic's tool. The immediate terror was the loss of the wrench's rigid connection after the explosion. While the entire apparatus hadn't failed, it had slipped significantly. The elevator surface was now permanently offset by several degrees, a phenomenon known as locked trim. The Hellcat was forced into a permanent, slight nose-up attitude. To maintain level flight, Harrison was forced to fight the plane constantly, holding the stick slightly forward and using the electric trim tab, the secondary, smaller control surface, to try and counteract the bias. The amount of forward pressure required was immense, turning a simple cruising flight into a sustained isometric workout. "Skull One report," Harrison rasped into the microphone. His voice was hoarse. "Wrench, we're with you," Finch replied, his voice laced with concern. "We saw that blast. You look rough. What's the damage report?" "Control linkage is compromised. I've lost half my pitch authority. I'm trimmed slightly nose up, and I'm heavy on the stick. Fuel is critical. We need vectors for the Lexington." The USS Lexington was approximately 130 miles to the east. The flight home, under normal circumstances, took 25 minutes. With a crippled plane needing constant high-power input to counteract the drag and maintain altitude, Harrison calculated a minimum flight time of 35 to 40 minutes, placing him critically close to running dry. Finch took the lead, adjusting his speed to match Harrison's maximum comfortable cruise of 230 knots. The other skullbusters formed a protective box around the crippled plane. They knew the danger. Stragglers were often picked off by remaining Japanese reconnaissance planes or submarines. The return journey was a torturous exercise in pain management and delicate control. Every minute, Harrison's muscles screamed against the constant forward pressure required to keep the nose level. He tried to use the trim wheel to relieve the pressure, but the trim tab was only designed for minor adjustments, not for overpowering a damaged primary control system. His forearm cramped repeatedly. Harrison recognized the engineering failure. The steel wire, though strong, had begun to stretch under the relentless tension of high-speed air pressure on the elevator. The wrench was slowly working its way free. He had to perform another emergency adjustment, but doing so now was impossible. He was too exhausted, and the plane was too unstable for him to contort himself into the fuselage again. He had to rely on the repair, holding long enough to reach the carrier. At 12:28 p.m., they had covered about 60 miles. The air was clearer now, the density of the fighting behind them. But the enemy was no longer the zero. It was gravity and the increasing drag caused by the compromised airframe. "Skull One, I'm dropping 2,000 feet to conserve fuel," Harrison announced, easing the stick forward, allowing the Hellcat to enter a shallow, fuel-saving glide. "Affirmative. We're tracking the fleet." 15 minutes to visual range, Finch responded. As they descended through 10,000 feet, Harrison noticed a new, critical issue. The fuel lines supplying the engine must have been grazed by the shrapnel or debris earlier. The fuel pressure gauge was fluctuating wildly, oscillating between a normal reading and a dangerous drop. A sudden pressure loss meant a fuel starvation event, which would cause the massive Pratt and Whitney engine to quit instantly. With a critical pitch control problem, an engine failure meant certain doom. Ditching an F-6F with fixed, damaged controls was a virtual guarantee of a rapid, catastrophic impact. Harrison needed to manipulate the fuel mixture settings and perhaps switch tanks, attempting to draw from the most stable reserve. He had to divert his concentration from the life-or-death task of holding the stick level to the secondary, but equally vital, task of keeping the engine running. He felt a deep sense of irony. He had fixed a structural problem using brute force engineering, only to be betrayed by the subtle mechanics of the engine supply. Survival, he knew, often hinged not on one great act of improvisation, but on a sustained series of microfixes. He took a deep breath, flexing his left hand to try and restore circulation, before reaching for the fuel mixture control dial, knowing that the smallest tremor in his right hand, the one holding the primary control stick, could send them all spiraling into the unforgiving sea. The ultimate test of the wrench was not how he fought, but how he landed. At 12:40 p.m., the American fleet, a constellation of gray warships and massive carriers, finally came into view. The sight was a beacon of safety, but it also marked the beginning of the most complex, high-risk part of Harrison's survival flight, the landing. The USS Lexington, their home carrier, was a floating target 872 feet long, rushing through the water at 25 knots. Landing an F-6F Hellcat on a carrier deck requires absolute precision in maintaining a constant angle of attack, a delicate balancing act, performed primarily by the elevator controls. Harrison's primary flight control for pitch was currently a heavy wrench secured with stretched wire, holding the plane permanently nose up. He could not perform the gentle, constant corrections demanded by the landing signal officer, LSO. Any sudden, large movement would likely cause the wrench to fail entirely, locking the elevator in a single, unrecoverable position. "Wrench, we're holding a pattern for you. You get the deck first," Finch reported. "LSO has been briefed. They know you're flying a kite on a string." The LSO, Lieutenant Commander Jim Wavetrain Kelly, was already standing on the edge of the Lexington's deck, arms crossed, watching the approach of the battered Hellcat. Kelly was a legend for his ability to talk pilots onto the deck in almost any condition, but this was unprecedented. Harrison checked his remaining fuel, 15 minutes max. He had one shot at this. If he missed the arresting wires, he wouldn't have enough fuel or control authority for a second approach. He started his descent toward 1,000 feet, easing the throttles back. The Hellcat, deprived of engine power, immediately became wallowy and unstable. He had to counteract the permanent nose-up bias with severe forward pressure on the stick. I need to drop my speed below 100 knots for the approach. I cannot risk the nose dropping hard, Harrison informed Kelly over the radio, bypassing the standard flight procedure. The standard carrier landing speed for an F-6F was 85 knots. Harrison was attempting a 95-knot approach faster, harder to stop, but necessary to maintain sufficient airflow over the compromised elevator. At 500 feet, the landing gear dropped, followed by the flaps. The increased drag immediately exacerbated the nose-up tendency. Harrison was now using both hands, leaning his entire body into the stick, trying to keep the plane level. His vision tunneled with the exertion. Kelly's voice crackled, calm but authoritative. "Wrench, you're high. Drop the nose slightly. Come on, bring it down." Harrison could hear the instruction, but he couldn't execute it easily. He pushed harder, agonizingly slowly. The plane was resistant, fighting him every inch. "Wrench, you're still high." "Where's the stick?" Kelly's tone sharpened. "I'm maxed out on forward pressure wave train." "This is all she's got," Harrison managed to groan, his voice strained. Kelly understood immediately. The plane was flying at its mechanical limit. The slightest further reduction in speed, or any relaxation of Harrison's pressure, and the plane would climb uncontrollably or stall catastrophically. Kelly switched his command. "Roger, wrench. Hold that attitude. Increase power slightly. We need to drag you down." The LSO was instructing Harrison to use engine power to control his descent rate, rather than relying on the elevator, a dangerous, non-standard maneuver that required immense coordination from the flight deck crew to clear the landing path instantly. Harrison increased the throttle a fraction. The engine roared, stabilizing the descent rate, but the nose was still too high for a proper trap. At 100 feet above the flight deck, the plane looked like it was landing tail first. He needed to drop the tail hook and pray for the best. He pressed the landing hook release. The steel hook slammed down into the airstream. At 20 feet, the deck was rushing up fast. Harrison could see Kelly waving frantic, precise commands. He had to arrest the plane's forward movement and hit the wires. He chopped the throttle, a move that normally drops the nose sharply. If the wrench failed now, the nose would snap up. The Hellcat would stall, and it would cartwheel over the deck, likely taking out Kelly and a handful of deck crew. The engine died. Harrison held the stick, the heavy wrench, with every ounce of his remaining strength, preventing the nose from rising. The Hellcat slammed onto the deck at 95 knots. The hook skidded, missing the first 3 wires. Then, with a jarring, violent lurch that threw Harrison forward against the straps, the hook snagged the 4th and final arresting wire. The plane stopped instantly. The silence was deafening, broken only by the roar of the massive carrier turbines and the screaming of the deck crew. Harrison released the stick. He felt an agonizing clunk as the tension on the wrench was finally released, and the elevator control surface swung freely. The wrench fix had held for 130 miles and 2 dogfights, failing only the moment the aircraft stopped moving. He had survived. He had delivered the plane and the engineering story. Want to know the ultimate fate of Jake Harrison and how his ridiculous repair technique changed Navy maintenance forever? Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm this story matters and helps more people discover it. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories. Back to the Lexington deck. The moment the Hellcat F6 F3 Buno 66205 came to a screeching halt on the deck of the USS Lexington, a wave of stunned silence rolled over the flight deck. Then, the silence broke into organized chaos. Deck crew rushed the plane, frantically waving signals for Harrison to fold his wings and taxi forward. Harrison, however, couldn't move. He sat motionless in the cockpit, his muscles locked into the posture required to hold the stick forward for the last 40 minutes. His relief was physical, debilitating. He fumbled with the canopy release, his hands trembling violently. Lieutenant Commander Finch landed moments later and taxied up to the stationary Hellcat, parking wings folded. He jumped out and ran to Harrison's cockpit. "Wrench! Get out of that damn thing!" Finch shouted, looking up at his friend's ashen face. Harrison managed a strained laugh. "Give me a minute, Dave. I think I fused to the controls." It took 2 strong deck hands and Finch pulling on Harrison as arms to extract him from the cockpit at 12:45 p.m. Harrison collapsed onto the oily deck, shivering despite the tropical heat. The immediate focus shifted from the pilot to the aircraft. Maintenance crews swarmed the plane, assessing the damage. The forward fuselage was scarred by shrapnel. The starboard wing root was shredded by cannon rounds, and the fuel lines were visibly leaking from the lower access panel. But the centerpiece of the inspection was the control linkage. A chief petty officer, the senior maintenance supervisor, peered through the inspection hatch behind the pilot's seat, armed with a flashlight. The silence from the maintenance crew was profound. The chief petty officer emerged, his face a mixture of awe and professional outrage, and he held up the object that had saved Harrison's life. It was the breaker, the adjustable spanner, still tightly bound to the remnants of the control rods by a complex weave of copper steel wire. The wire was frayed, stretched, and in one spot almost completely severed, having been worn down by friction against an airframe bulkhead. The heavy wrench handle was bent slightly from the stress of the dogfight and the final landing. "Commander Harrison," the chief said, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of the deck, "you flew 130 miles, shot down 2 zeros, and landed on a carrier with a standard issue shop wrench acting as your entire pitch control system." "It was non-standard wire, Chief," Harrison corrected weakly, still sitting on the deck. "Navy issue wouldn't have held." The story of the wrench fix spread through the carrier group with the speed of jet fuel. It wasn't just a tale of pilot heroism. It was a physical, tangible example of the survival engineering that defined the campaign. In an environment where logistics were strained and damage was frequent, Harrison had proven that a pilot's mechanical intuition could override impossible odds. The maintenance team spent the next hour documenting the repair with extreme detail. Photographs were taken from every angle. The official report noted the extraordinary field modification and calculated that the binding wire had endured tensile forces up to 3 times its rated capacity during the final pull-up and subsequent landing. The Hellcat Buno 66205 was deemed too damaged for immediate repair and was struck from the flight roster. However, the makeshift control system was carefully disassembled and retained. The incident was logged not just as a mission report, but as a technical bulletin. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, BUAir, realized that formalizing survival engineering solutions might be key to increasing operational efficiency. For Harrison, the ordeal was over, but the consequence of his physical strain was immediate. His arms were effectively useless, crippled by muscle fatigue and minor tissue damage from fighting the heavy, dead controls. The flight surgeon ordered him to be grounded for 72 hours, an order Harrison knew was necessary. As he was escorted below deck, he paused at the edge of the flight deck, watching the recovered Zeros being shoved overboard. He wasn't thinking about the kills or the engineering. He was thinking about the feeling of the stick in his hands, the familiar connection between pilot and machine, mediated by a simple wrench. The Battle of the Marianas continued raging above. Harrison's fight was done, but the story of the wrench was just beginning its journey through the U.S. Navy command structure. The story of Jake Harrison's mid-air repair became more than just an anecdote. It became a formalized case study within the U.S. Navy. Within weeks of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the technical report on Buno 66205, complete with photographs of the wrench and wire splint, landed on the desk of Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff. Nimitz's staff recognized the potential. While the Navy prized standardization and precision, the reality of Pacific combat demanded flexibility. A single pilot had saved a $500,000 aircraft, his own life, and likely protected the fleet by ignoring the regulations and embracing pure utilitarian improvisation. The official response was a classic bureaucratic double-take. Harrison received a Distinguished Flying Cross for the 2 confirmed kills and for saving his aircraft. Concurrently, he received a stern official reprimand for using unauthorized equipment, specifically the breaker, which was deemed excessive and dangerous by the Buoy Maintenance Authority. However, the reprimand was a formality designed to satisfy the safety committees. The practical implementation was revolutionary. The Navy quietly initiated the Contingency Repair Standardization Program, CRSP. While they couldn't officially endorse the use of smuggled shop tools, they began rapidly implementing protocols that encouraged field mechanics and even pilots to develop and share innovative, non-standard repair techniques using available scrap or non-critical components. The Harrison fix, the technique of using a rigid, external object to temporarily bridge a severed control linkage, was integrated into advanced survival training curriculum. Specialized, lightweight emergency repair kits, standardized across the fleet, were rapidly developed and issued, containing high-tensile wire and specific quick-fix tools remarkably similar to the contents of Harrison's infamous canvas satchel. Harrison himself was rotated off combat duty shortly after, not because of injury, but to travel across the Pacific theater, teaching other fighter squadrons the art of flying a crippled machine. He was officially promoted to commander, but unofficially he was recognized as the Chief of Survival Engineering. His briefings were legendary, crammed with pilots and mechanics eager to learn how to keep a plane flying when the manual said it was impossible. He often started his lectures with a blunt warning. The enemy isn't just the zero pilot. The enemy is thinking you can't fix it. The manual is guidelines. Gravity is the only law. The incident defined the character of the Skullbuster Squadron. They continued to be recognized as the most unconventional yet effective fighter unit in the Pacific. A group of pilots who treated their planes not as delicate instruments, but as robust, customizable tools. Harrison's Hellcat, Buno 66205, never flew again, but its story echoed far beyond the Lexington. Decades later, a replica of the bent wrench, the breaker, was displayed in a Naval Aviation Museum exhibit dedicated to the ingenuity of World War II mechanics, an enduring symbol of how human adaptability could overcome overwhelming technical failure. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was a massive victory for the American forces, eliminating over 400 Japanese aircraft. But amidst the overwhelming numbers and the strategic sweep of the battle, the legend of Commander Jake. The wrench Harrison provided a human-scale lesson. Victory wasn't just about superior industrial output. It was about the individual courage to break the rules, improvise, and refuse to accept defeat. His contribution ensured that hundreds of other aircraft would return home, fixed by the techniques he proved possible at 18,000 feet. Commander Jake the Wrench Harrison survived the war, retiring from the Navy, having transformed the way the service viewed field maintenance and survival engineering. He was the embodiment of the idea that in the chaos of battle, the rules must yield to the reality of survival. His actions over the Philippine Sea in 1944 saved not only his own life, but also countless others by proving the capacity for impossible, on-the-fly repair. The story of the F-6F Hellcat, the heavy wrench, and the high-tensile wire is a testament to the grit and ingenuity of the men who fought the air war in the Pacific. They were pilots, but they were also mechanics, engineers, and improvisers, constantly battling not just the enemy, but the mechanical limitations of the machines they depended on. Harrison often said that the greatest debt owed was not to the factories that built the planes, but to the men who kept them flying against all logic. His fight was over in minutes, but its reverberations lasted decades, redefining the line between the impossible and the merely difficult. He and the Skullbuster Squadron proved that sometimes the best tool for the job is the one you know best, no matter how unauthorized it may be. If this story moved you, don't just click away. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you're rewatching from, and whether anyone in your family served in World War II, especially in the Pacific Theater. You are part of the reason these men aren't erased from history. Our community is global, and together we're guarding these memories from being lost. Jake Harrison paid the price for our freedom. All we're asked to do is remember. Never forget.